hey, if you look at the time, it's after 6. Happy International Whiskey Day, After 6 Cocktails viewers. So, as a result, we're going to talk a bit about whiskey. Whiskey is made from grain, is made from distilled grain spirits and then aged in wood. We've got many different types of whiskey here. We have rye whiskey. We actually have 2 different types of Scotch whiskey. We have some Irish whiskey, some bourbon, and some Tennessee whiskey. Bourbon and Tennessee whiskey are quite similar, except Tennessee whiskey must go through a charcoal filtering process. Irish whiskey is made in Ireland and can only be made in Ireland. Scotch whiskey can only be made in Scotland and has a lot of rules surrounding how it's supposed to be made. Like this Port Charlotte whiskey is made from the region of Islay in Scotland, which is an island off the west coast of Scotland. This is a single malt Scotch whiskey, meaning that it comes from one distillery, the Bruichladdich distillery, and it's one distillery. It's made from 100% malted barley, and it has to be aged. For this one, it has to be aged at least 10 years in barrels. And since it's from Islay, the common style involves smoking the malted barley with peat. So we should probably. There's also many taste differences in these whiskeys. So glass 1 will be a bit of rye whiskey. And glass 2 will be a bit of bourbon. Number 3 will be Irish. This bottle is very difficult to pour. It looks cool, and I really do like this whiskey, but the bottle is very, very, very difficult to hold on and pour and move. And then instead of using that Dalmore, I'd like to use the Port Charlotte just because it highlights the Islay flavors so well. So we'll start here with the rye whiskey. It has a very sweet and fruity nose. The nose is what you smell, is like the smells and odors you get from a whiskey. Fruity, maybe honeysuckle a little bit, but very fruity. When you taste it though, I personally do not get fruitiness. I just get a lot of barrel char. It's very spicy, you could call it. But from my personal opinion and experience, it comes from the barrel char used to age this whiskey. Rye and bourbon American whiskeys must be aged in new American charred oak barrels. So, notice on this bourbon is similar to the rye. It still has that very fruity, sweetish nose. Except The barrel char is still there, except that this Maker's Mark bourbon is, the fruit actually shows up for me in the taste, which is much different than the Michter's Rye. So now let's compare that to a Tennessee whiskey, like my good old. Let's compare. Shit. Okay. Now let's compare this to. Let's compare the bourbon and the rye to a. Let's compare the bourbon and the rye to Tennessee whiskey, which is made quite similarly to bourbon. Made quite similarly to bourbon, but goes through a charcoal filtering process. Very fruity, vanilla on the nose. No barrel char, and if there is some, it's very minimal. A bit smokiness, but not too much. A lot of vanilla on the taste. The texture is incredibly smooth. So if you do not like bourbon or rye, if you want to drink whiskey neat, maybe try Tennessee whiskey. Because I personally want the fruity and vanilla notes, but I cannot drink bourbon or rye neat because of the barrel char. It's so prominent. So that's why if I want an American whiskey in my whiskey journey neat, I usually grab Jack Daniels. Moving away from the Americas, and now we're going to go over to Ireland. We have the Sexted single malt Irish whiskey. The nose is very, very, very fruity and floral. Honeysuckle, I believe. I've smelled this once before in a Scotch whiskey called the Glenlivet. I've smelled honeysuckle and the fruitiness in a Scotch whiskey called Glenlivet. Let's see what the taste tells us. Malty, very malty. A bit pretzel-y, but not too much. Honeysuckle, yes, on the taste. Vanilla, maybe a bit like, and that fruitiness. I've had other Irish whiskeys. The first Irish whiskey I've ever had was Jameson, and I did not like it. It had a very metallic note, but I think I can attribute that to the fact that it's not a single pot still, it's not a pot still whiskey or a single malt whiskey. And a bit of grain whiskey in the blend as well. The Sexted, on the other hand, is a single malt Irish whiskey. And I don't detect any of that metallic note at all. And now let's go across that little waterway to Scotland and taste some Islay whiskey. On the nose, Islay whiskeys have a very salty, briny, maritime feel to me. For me, they have the most persistent finish, which is very smoky. I use smoky as a description because it reminds me a lot of smoked fish and smoked meats, like a barbecue. It smells like a damp campfire, and I love it. I am a big fan of Islay Scotch whiskey. And since now we've talked a lot about the different kinds of whiskey, we're going to make a whiskey cocktail. So the whiskey cocktail we're going to make today is called a Bobby Burns. It's named for the Scottish poet Robert Burns. It uses Scotch whiskey. I have my Dalmore 12 single malt Scotch whiskey. A lot of these recipes call for blended Scotch whiskey. I don't have any with me at the moment, and I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of blended malts, of blended whiskey. Blended Scotch whiskey, I should say. It also requires red vermouth and the herbal liqueur called benedictine, which was created by monks in the long ago, and its recipe is still closely guarded. It's a closely guarded secret. So to start making this cocktail, we need to put some ice in. 3/4 ounce of the sweet vermouth. Half an ounce of the benedictine herbal liqueur. And 2 ounces of Highland Scotch whiskey. Since there is no citrus involved in this drink at all, or egg, it's going to be stirred. You're going to strain it into the glass. And have a taste. It's similar to a Manhattan, and that is a combination of whiskey and sweet vermouth. But I think using Highland, using single malt Scotch whiskey, changes the flavor dimension, so to speak. It adds some depth and complexity. And adding the benedictine releases everything. I actually like this much better than your standard Manhattan. I really do like this. Thank you for watching this video. This has been After 6 Cocktails, and have a good night.